So Jessica, do you want to kick it off
Yeah,
or?
sure.
Okay, go for it. Yeah.
So I actually had the pleasure of meeting Mimi. I don't know if you remember last year, she came out to State College and was a keynote at one of our local conferences. So it's great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you again.
So I'm just going to give you a little background on Mimi. So Mimi Ito is a cultural anthropologist of technology use, examining children and youth's changing relationships to media and communications. She's also professor in residence at John D. Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation and the chair in the Digital Media and Learning at the University of California, Irvine, with appointments in the University of California Humanities Research Institute, the development of anthropology, and the development of informatics, I hope I said that correctly. In Japan, her research has focused on mobile and portable technologies, and she co-edited a book on the topic of personal portable pedestrian mobile phones in Japanese life. She's had 3 collaborative ethnographic studies founded by the MacArthur Foundation, examining youth new media practices in the US and focusing on gaming, digital media production, and internet use. Continuing work on informal learning with new media with the research of the MacArthur Foundation, she is research director of the Digital Media and Learning Hub at UC Irvine and chair of the MacArthur Research Network of Connected Learning. So thank you for being here, Mimi. So can you give us a brief background on how you got into education and kind of into this space of digital media?
Sure. So I am an anthropologist and an educational researcher by training, and most of my research has focused on just understanding how young people, mostly teenagers, use new media technology like games and mobile phones and internet and remix culture and things like that. And I think I'm both a bit unconventional for internet research, but also for educational research because I look at these sort of social and recreational practices as sites of learning, and more I've been trying to understand how we can connect with those sort of social, interest-driven kinds of activities that young people are doing as educators and make them more relevant for accessing educational, civic, and career opportunity for kids. So it's kind of been a journey where, a lot of my early work was really just hanging out with kids on the internet and looking at the digital world from their point of view. And more, it's been about building partnerships and collaborations with educators and technology makers to understand how we can make, what kids are doing and learning with new technology relevant for our practice.
So you've talked about a lot of the projects that you've done. So what of those projects or initiatives make you most proud?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's like for all the different hats I wear, there's probably a different project I could cite. So I'll name a couple. I mean, I think our digital youth project that resulted in the Hanging Out, Messing Around, Geeking Out book, was really important for us because it was the first time that I think there's been a large-scale ethnographic study that really involved a ton of different case studies of different youth media practices where we came together and synthesized it across different kinds of youth cultures. So we were able to tell a story not just about a single case study, which is what anthropologists actually do most of the time, but also how different kinds of youth cultures and practices related to one another. So, the really geeky kids versus the kids who are using mobile or social media, they're all part of the same cultural universe, but they have very different behaviors. So that was a project I was really proud of. And then, I think the other piece that I'm really immersed in right now is this project or this effort to build a coalition around connected learning, which is really about, connecting research, practice, design, the opportunity to work with folks from different fields, backgrounds, and different expertise to really build things that make a difference in the world. And, it's not work that I've necessarily been leading except on the research side, but efforts like the U Media Learning Labs, which are youth maker spaces in libraries and museums, the Quest to Learn schools that Katie Salen and her team at Institute of Play have been really instrumental in. And, most recently, Katie and I, together with Tara Brown, who's a leader in the maker movement, have started our own startup. It's a benefit corporation called Connected Camps, which is delivering online learning experiences in the game of Minecraft. And I'm really proud of that effort right now because it's sort of a passion project where we're trying to take a lot of what we've learned about how kids engage with commercial entertainment, but make it kind of intergenerational and educational sort of environment.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on your work with the connected learning? A little bit more about how it's a dynamic reimagining of education and how it can provide its learners in society. So what is it? Can you describe a little bit more about it and what it's doing?
Yeah, so connected learning was sort of a model for both describing a certain kind of learning, but also for an agenda for research and design that really took a learner-focused perspective and was really synthesizing a lot of the state-of-the-art of the learning sciences, but also what practitioners and designers were understanding and developing in practice. And it emerged from a lot of the MacArthur Foundation-funded projects, so it really is a much broader network that is as much about, saying, oh, we learned a lot of things from these projects, but looking out there at what a lot of, progressive educators are already doing with new technology and saying, look, what does it take to accomplish a lot of the long-standing goals of progressive education with new technology? So that's sort of the motivating thesis of connected learning. And how we think about it from a learning sciences perspective is that, we're in an environment where young people are growing up in a context of abundance of information and social connection, which differs really from, when a lot of our educational institutions were founded, where, young people needed access to particular kinds of learning institutions in order to access relationships and information that had to do with specialized knowledge. And of course, today the environment is very different. And it really sort of pushes us to consider how we can think of learning less as something that's transmission of knowledge, but something that's more about connecting and introducing and brokering young people to opportunities as much as it is about, sharing, instructing, transmitting knowledge, and then expecting it to transfer across context. So it really is sort of a model of learning that's been there in the progressive approaches, whether it's Dewey or contemporary learning sciences that come from the socio-cultural tradition. But we're really saying, look, what if we reframe the fundamental purpose of our educational institutions as not a pipeline in the sense that we're handing kids off from one institution to another in a progression, but a process of network and connection building that's really learner-centered rather than institution-centered. And so we talk about connected learning as that moment when young people are able to have an experience that is connected to their own interests and identities, something that's personally meaningful to them. So it's an interest-driven model, but they're able to pursue that interest with a supportive network, a set of relationships with peers, caring adults, and they're able to connect that to opportunity. So I'll give you an example from some of our research where, we met so many young people who are going online to go deep into an area of interest, whether it's fandom or gaming or a creative interest. And they really describe the sense that, oh, I finally found my people. They're really into the things that I'm into, super excited. And that supportive context really pushed them to get better at something, to share things with another community of expertise who also appreciated and rewarded them and made their work relevant. But a lot of those kids were not able to connect those interests to educational opportunity or civic opportunity or career opportunity. So they might get really good at something like video remixing or writing or coding, but most of the educational institutions, the civic institutions, the workplaces didn't really have a way of seeing or recognizing it. So we see a real opportunity to kind of close that loop and bring that third sphere into play, because young people have this opportunity to, access these online communities of interest, these free and open online resources in ways that really weren't available until fairly recently. But I think as educators, we haven't quite figured out the kinds of practices, processes, institutional policies that enable us to say, look, go online, do interesting things, and we'll support you and recognize you and fill in the pieces of your network and ecosystem that you need filled in.
So how do you personally encourage your students that you mentor to make this impact that you've just kind of talked about?
Yeah, so again, I'll give a concrete example. One of the things that we've been looking at really closely is this idea of affinity-based mentorship, which is, this that comes from our research that's really found that, when young people are able to be mentored by somebody who not only has the knowledge and expertise, but who shares an interest and who they feel deeply connected to, we know that's very transformative. And that relationship is often one where, there is knowledge sharing, there is expertise, like whether that's a, tennis coach or whether it's, a teacher, but there's also the ability to really know that student and direct them to opportunities, suggest things, connect with their interests. So that seems like a really important relationship in kids' lives. And there's quite a lot of research that shows that, independent of other factors, it's one of the things that has one of the biggest effects for not just connected learning, but just life success and thriving. So, when we were working with Nicole Pinker to develop, and she was developing the UMedia Learning Lab model, she brought in teaching artists who were experts and really embodied the identity of the interests and the cultural identity of the young people she was trying to attract to the space. So they were spoken word artists, there were digital media artists, there were musicians who came in and, the DYN team trained them to be good mentors and to work with young people. And there were also youth librarians of the space who were obviously really well, they were experts at connecting with young people. And what was really magical about those relationships is that, those bonds that the young people made with mentors who sort of, they felt they could really connect with as full people, but also because they were artists who were were active artists. So they had social capital and connections in the city and the wider community. So when they found a young person who was interested in, say, spoken word, they would also support them competing in a citywide or even a national competition. So they were able to broker and broaden those networks that young people have. We have a similar model with, our Connected Camps, our Minecraft program, because we bring in sort of world-class game designers and curriculum designers to design the programs, but we actually train high school and college students to work with the younger kids, because they're the ones who are genuine Minecraft nerds and totally into it and follow everything about Minecraft. There's no way we as grown-ups could be like authentic experts in the Minecraft universe to the extent that, a college student or a high school student who's really into it themselves could. So, we do a lot of training and, teach them how to moderate conflict and work with young people. And, there's really nothing more exciting for, a 10 or 11-year-old to be working with a big brother or big sister who's just a few years older than them, who, embody that identity, who have tons of knowledge, but they're also there to help them, which is something that they don't usually have when they just go online and meet strangers on the internet. So it's just filling those little gaps in the ecosystem and trying to understand how, there's like a ton of opportunity with something like Minecraft, but there's this missing piece, which is that, young people aren't incentivized or trained necessarily to be helpful teachers to littler kids. And so trying to leverage what's already in the ecosystem, but connect the dots where there's disconnections.
There's a question in the chat box I kind of want to bring up that goes along this line. So how can young people make their learning transparent to prospective employees? So as they, grow older, and are employers responding?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think what we're seeing is that in fields that are characterized by really fast-paced change, where traditional kinds of credentialing and coursework aren't really keeping up. So you see this first in something like coding or creative arts, that employers are already using different kinds of metrics to understand, how young people are successful. So, for example, DeviantArt, which is, the biggest online platform for visual art sharing and publication, a lot of art schools and employers already look at kids' DeviantArt portfolios for work and for art school admissions. So that's an example where it's kind of happened organically, where, you know, if you have somebody who's been publishing their work on the internet, who has tons of followers and likes, that itself is already validating for certain kind of professions. I think a similar thing happens with YouTube, like, you know, we're seeing that when kids or sites like, there's a coding site, I'm blanking on the name, but, you know, where, you know, coders can do open coding competitions. And, you know, if you have millions of followers on your YouTube already, or if you've won these coding competitions, or if you have really beautiful artwork on DeviantArt, you know, these are all things that matter already. With coding in particular, there's a lot of alternative credentialing and kind of educational institutions that a lot of employers see as more valid than a traditional sort of computer science degree. So, you know, you see a school like Epitech in France, and, you know, they started 42 just recently here in the US, but, you know, these are coding academies with a radically different pedagogy. They don't have teachers, it's all pure learning, and they have a reputation now of graduating students who are just incredible coders and have been really, really successful. So, you know, it's kind of the proof is in the pudding for some of these alternative models. And as, you know, these different, more peer-to-peer kind of open type systems are successful in producing really great results in talent, and, you know, they're lower risk because you're employing people who have already been proven to be successful. I think these alternatives are going to start getting more and more attractive for certain fields, not every field.
Yeah. What was the name of that alternative coding school in the US?
42.
42. Okay, it was just
comes from the For You Hitchhiker Guide. Yeah. It's a nerd reference.
So one of the areas it seems like people want you to drill a little bit more into is the Affinitybased mentorship. So how is it set up? Finding mentors, training the mentors, etc.
Yeah, so I think we're still really early in our learning curve. And, you know, I think it's something that, you know, good programs have been doing already for a long time, especially sort of youth development type programs, informal programs, that when you talk to a lot of informal educators, they'll say that, you know, their secret sauce is really their ability to connect with youth around their interests. So it's not like it's something radically new. And, you know, this is what good teachers have always done, is, you know, connect with their young people and really understand what their interests are, and, you know, be able to connect young people who they know deeply to opportunities. And, you know, we saw this in our case studies as well, that, you know, especially unless they happen to be kids who are growing up in creative class families that were really connected with digital interests, it was usually the teachers who were the ones that were able to close that circle when it happened, because a young person would confide in a teacher, oh, actually, I do write fan fiction, even though they're usually really embarrassed to say things like that. But if they're a teacher that they feel really connected to, they'll share those things. And that English teacher might tell them to write for the school newspaper, or might suggest that they take a different class in school. And those moments when a young person has a mentor who they trust and care enough to confide, you know, their interests, their aspirations, you know, that's really, really transformative. So it's not like, you know, that person has to be in a bucket, right? That is like a teaching artist or some particular category, but it's really about the quality of the relationship. And, you know, we saw that in, you know, there was a massive study done by Gallup and Purdue of 30,000 college graduates. And it's the students who said that they connected deeply with a faculty member during their time in college that really showed the most positive outcomes, like many years later. So again, this is something that is part of our educational practice that we're just trying to sort of highlight and elevate as a really important factor. Now, you can more intentionally design for it, and that, you know, the example of connected camps or the digital youth network mentoring model is a really good example. I'll give one more example that comes from, you know, the research team on our network who is really most focused on mentoring, which is Jean Rhodes' group. And she has a center for evidence-based mentorship that has been running for many, many years. And since she's been part of our Connected Learning Research Network, she's really been, you know, thinking about models of mentorship that are more youth initiated and youth centered rather than the traditional kind of big brothers, big sister model, which, you know, has a particular theory that if you match a privileged kid with a less privileged kid, good things are going to happen, but it's not necessarily an affinity-based model, and it's actually one that ends up being pretty complicated. And she did this meta-analysis of you know, a lot of the more traditional youth mentoring programs and found, you know, not surprisingly, when young people are connected to mentors based on interest, the effects are better, right? But a lot of programs don't actually look at shared interest or cultural identity as a way of matching. But she's developed a really interesting program that she's running now at UMass, where she's actually has a training or a course that helps young people develop skills to recruit their own mentors. So another really important finding from her work is that when young people select their mentors and actually recruit their own mentors, the effects are much better. So it's not necessarily that we have to provide mentors. And in fact, when, you know, some of our digital programs, we did explicit mentor matching, that is incredibly difficult to get right. Actually, you know, in our model, it's about creating context where it's like, oh, we're going to do this thing together that's interesting, and then mentorship, you know, happens naturally as a side product of doing shared interest-based activities. That's one model. You know, the model that Jean's trying at UMass is really to say, look, folks, it's really important that you find mentors in your lives, and here are the skills and the ways that you can do that, which I also think is a really interesting approach.
So do you think that these mentorships are better face-to-face or online, or is there really no difference?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think they're different, right? Because obviously if you have an in-person relationship, you know, there's sort of a, you know, authenticity and a deepness to it that is really, really important. And some kids do much better with that kind of relationship. I think the advantage of online is that it enables specialization and a different kind of safety, so that, you know, a lot of times, like kids, especially if, you know, they're not in really dense urban regions, and they may have a fairly specialized interest. I mean, one of the things that we know is that kids have really diverse interests. And, you know, if you happen to, you know, like basketball or football or, you know, something that's, you know, or math, science, or English, something that's school sponsored, then you're in luck. But what if you're like the badminton player or the kid who's into anime or, you know, some other niche identity? And then, you know, the online world suddenly gives you access to this, you know, community of incredibly specialized and, you know, nerdy, you know, deep, immersive, interest-based experiences that really weren't available before. And there's something about, you know, the safety of being able to pursue those interests without fear of stigmatization and judgment, which is also what a lot of kids get in school and are afraid of. So, you know, we did one study of fans of professional wrestling who, you know, they wouldn't reveal their interest in their local peer group because the stakes are so high for being cool and fitting in, but they could connect with those interests in a safe online space that was really, really empowering. You know, even when you had like tweens who were into One Direction, which, you know, they're an incredibly popular boy band, and, you know, during the heyday, like, you know, a really big proportion of any, you know, middle school girl population probably would have been into them, but they still didn't feel like they could share their interest in their classroom, you know, among their peer group. But, you know, online, they could just go all out, you know, and be, you know, screaming fangirls and not be judged. And, you know, there was the freedom to be who you are for some interests that, you know, are not high status within a local peer group.
That kind of reminds me of one of my first mentors. It was started out face to face, but then we both moved to different areas. So it naturally kind of turned into an online mentorship. Do you see that with a lot of children where it's something that maybe they start to create these relationships that are beyond, say, the project that they're working on, that it becomes more of like a lifelong mentorship? Or do you think it's very situational?
Yeah, I think this is the other effect of online networks that is really, really important and is supportive and protective of connected learning and social capital and relationships is because, you're able to sustain and continue relationships and keep connections warm even when you've moved institutions, you've moved locations. So we found that really early on when we were doing research with the first big wave of mobile phone adoption in Japan, where high school kids developed a new category called chutomo, but it meant middle school friend. And they were able to keep in touch with their friends from middle school after they moved to high school, which was like, if you think about it, it was kind of impossible for them to do that before they had mobile phones. So this category of middle school friend did not pre-exist the mobile phone. So it's like suddenly you have the ability to maintain relationships. And I think for connected learning and our model of learning, it's really, really important because, I don't think it's like those relationships suddenly evaporated even before we had online communications. But, this idea that they're actually, young people need to be supported in developing a supportive network of relationships, and that you think of learning not as pouring things into a kid's head, but actually a process of building a wider and more diverse set of networks. If the ability to sustain those networks is more resilient because of online communication, it means the model of learning as connection building, relationship building is that much more robust.
So to transition kind of the conversation a little bit, a lot of your work, is really impacting, I think, a lot of people. And at the DML conference this year, you conducted a sold-out workshop called the Powerbrokers Building Youth Social Capital Through Connected Learning. Can you tell us a little bit about this event and the impact that it's had on the field?
Yeah, so this was actually, led by Dixie Ching, who has been doing a lot of work with the Hive Network in New York, which is a network of youth-serving organizations that are collaborating to provide new digital type learning opportunities to young people. And one of the outcomes of working in this sort of collaborative networked way across organizations is that folks realize that a big part of what they need to do and what wasn't within their traditional organizational charter was thinking about the ways that we could connect opportunities across different organizations. So, often as educators and as educational reformers, we take a very organization-centered point of view, like how can we get kids into our programs? How can we optimize the learning that's happening when the kids are in our walls, rather than really thinking about what's the next step and how are we bringing kids in, and how does what we do as educators fit within a broader network of opportunities for a particular young person, for a particular range of interests. And I think what's really exciting about the conversations coming out of the Hive and what we were doing in the workshop is that, there's this groundswell coming from youth-serving organizations to look at things like mentorship and brokering as a fundamental aspect of what educators do if we're really wanting to support youth interests and development, rather than really just about maximizing the numbers and the efficacy of our own programs. So something like brokering is like, have you effectively moved kids out of your program, becomes a really, really important metric and a set of design principles that, again, it's not that programs hadn't been considering at all, but we're just trying to elevate that this connection building is just as important for young people in expanding their opportunities as the fact that they've acquired specific skills and competencies within your specific program. And, I think it's very relevant to, what's happened, this week in this country, and, trying to understand how to, build coalitions across organizations, and, to really think honestly and transparently about, what are the interests of, us as teachers, researchers, what are the interests of our students, and what are the interests of the organizations? And they're not always the same. And I think we have to be super honest about that, and also understand that, the process of understanding, connecting with, organizations that are, not, totally about our benefit and our organization, our self-interest. We learn so much from that. So I think educators, formal educators, understanding how their work connects with informal educators, people like me who are in kids' peer internet-y culture, like we all have like a different perspective to bear on this systemic problem of how to support young people, how to support their learning, their interests, and helping them thrive. And I think these conversations that are happening at the intersections that are sort of interdisciplinary and across different learning institutions are really, really exciting, because it's saying, how can we find those points where, we are aligning because we are supporting young people. That is our shared purpose. And that feels really exciting to me and qualitatively different than, like the debates we're having, like as somebody in higher education, the conversations we have about how do we really support our young people are different from like, how do we maintain the status of our institutions? What are our rankings? What are our, efficacy for our outcomes? They're just qualitatively different conversations that are really, really exciting.
So it's about that time where I want to open up the questions to the audience. But while they're starting to type in their questions, we've asked most of the panelists today one question of, who inspires you and what has shaped you as an educator?
Oh my God, there's so many people who have inspired me, but I have to say, like, for me, my inspiration is always teenagers. Like, I love them and I learn so much. And, the young, like, I've never had an original idea. It's always come from the, younger folks. And, again, to this week's events, like, I just am so blown away by, the energy that kids brought to this, this whole political mess, and how they're continuing to just surprise us and keep us honest. So I think they're my inspiration, really.
We've had, I think, pretty much across the board, every person answered it has somehow looped in their students and they work in part of their passion, which is great. And then you're in the right job because
I know. There's a reason why we do the work we do. Yeah.
Exactly. I just wanted to, and certainly please everybody in the text chat, please take this opportunity to post some questions. Our earlier speakers today, and we've got Heidi with us, who actually kicked us off from the Department of Ed in Octave, which is working with adults in career and technical education. And a lot of the projects we're working on at Designers for Learning are targeting the adult basic education. And so I'm trying to, pull and grab a lot of the concepts you're talking about. And we talk a lot about contextualized learning, which I think shares a lot with your connected learning, which I know does have kind of both the technology, connecting, like literally connecting, and then connecting it to the academic to the then real life. So how do you think some of the concepts you work on with the youth would transfer to, and now we're talking about a very specific population of adults who aren't technology literate, as Heidi ran through a lot of unfortunate statistics regarding skill gaps with technology, and then just having failed at one point or another in formal education. And so we're trying to reach them in creative ways. So any thoughts on that? Is this any area you've ever worked in, or if you could help us out, give us some pointers?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, it's not an area that I have a lot of expertise, but, what you're describing, I think, really resonates with, a lot of our approach and our philosophy, in that, the point is that I think, it is about lifelong learning, and not about saying that, learning needs to be in a particular kind of box or a particular kind of setting, but that, it's really about what are the, needs, concerns, interests, what's relevant to the learner. And, it's in the context, right? Like that, this idea that we have to create these sequestered environments and sequestered life stages for learning is, I think, increasingly being disrupted. So what you're describing seems to be totally in line with what we're seeing. So, even when we're looking at young people, we find that a lot of young adults who may be college graduates, but they didn't really have any vocational focus to what they were doing in higher education. After they graduate, they're like, oh, I guess I need some skills for the workplace. And then they're going to, Udacity or these online learning platforms or a coding boot camp or whatever it might be to learn data science or to learn something that is actually vocationally relevant, which isn't necessarily what they might have been focused in the traditional educational system. So I think the question of like learners who don't necessarily have the fluency or the comfort with the technology is, a unique gap that I'm hoping some of these new models and platforms might help address. But I do think that the overall need, the fact that, we're in a context where, the workplace and the technology and the job situation is changing so rapidly means that, we can't really expect people to learn everything in their first 16 or 18 years of life that's going to sustain their careers for the rest of their lives. So it's a problem that, is totally agnostic as to life stage at this point, I think.
And then tying into your comments, I was one of the ones in the text chat asking you about the mentorship and the peer-to-peer. It's really something, at least none of our subject matter experts have raised, this idea of the learners kind of draw. We talk a little bit about, and we talked about it today, family literacy, where I guess that would be a very specific affinity group, right? You're working on something within your family unit, but that was really set some light bulbs off, trying to think of ways that could apply, because this whole idea of relevancy and why am I doing this? Even I've already failed once in formal education. Yeah, I need to get a job, but it seems so far out of reach. These jobs you're talking about and the skills that are required. It's just kind of bridging that. How do you make that happen? And that was just kind of the concept of bringing in the peers to try to make
and I think as academics, this is how we got our professional training, right? So if we reflect on our, how graduate students and, postdocs and academics both got trained within that, moratorium period, but also as we continue to learn, it's a totally peer-based model. I mean, we call it peer review. We use all of the language of peer-to-peer learning and mentorship in how, academics, because, again, it's a field that you have to stay constantly on top of things. It's not like you can just stop learning as an academic and an expert in your field. So I think in whether it's like, vocational, any kind of vocational field, I think has a dimension of peer-to-peer learning already. And for some reason, like in K-12 and higher ed, we sort of sequestered it, but the more prevalent mode of learning is actually more based on this peer-to-peer model. It just feels different when we're talking about, younger folks and applying this model, I think.
And we'll let you go, but I think we did have one more question in the, John had a question, I don't know if you can see it in the text chat. Is there a distinction between teenagers, youth who build social capital online only without face-to-face interaction versus youth who build social capital primarily face-to-face?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I don't think we've really have ways of, necessarily. It's one of those things that's very hard to investigate systematically, right? But I do think that there's, just from our qualitative case studies, obviously there are important differences, and there are good and bad on both sides. Like if I was to characterize it really broadly, I think the online networks have the benefit of specialization, right, and accessibility. And so young people are able to more easily move in and out and access more specialized communities of interest online, usually. But then, the face-to-face contexts have the strength of, the supportive relationships that are able to scaffold connections to those local institutions that have a lot of power over kids' lives. So, if you're really looking to change opportunity, those face-to-face connections are going to generally have a lot more power. And we definitely have seen cases where online relationships translate into something like a real workplace opportunity or, an educational opportunity. But, by far the weight of that kind of transformative difference happens in local relationships and institutions. And I don't think it's because somehow those relationships are more real or meaningful. It's just that those relationships are tied to institutions of power in young people's lives in ways that online relationships tend not to be.
Yeah, great points. Well, thank you so much. And I hope you don't mind if I drop you an email maybe when I when I have a chance to get these things.
Yeah, I'd love to learn more about your work too. So
Yeah, well, we mentioned it a couple times today that we're trying to get away from this idea of dump content, quiz, dump.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, those that are joining us, helping us to design instruction, many have not, you know, this is kind of new to them. They're just first projects that they're designing, and then they fall back to that trap of. So that's what's been most exciting about today is everyone's bringing together all these creative ideas, and as you're saying, looking outside of what we've traditionally done within the walls of an institution. It's
Yeah.
inspiring to hear. So thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you. And good luck with the marathon. You guys seem to have a lot of energy and motoring on, so I'm super impressed.
We're taking breaks. Jason's taking his break right now. We're not doing a full 24. We're just doing the 12.
12. Okay.
Okay,
that's still pretty impressive. So
maybe next year we'll try the 24.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again.
Okay. Thanks a lot. This was a lot of fun. Bye.
Bye.